January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal. The air smelled of rust and salt and rotting canvas. In a tent hospital 2 miles inland from Henderson Field, a Navy corpsman named Robert Harlan knelt beside a stretcher, his knees pressed into mud that had once been coral dust. The Marine on the stretcher was 19 years old, unconscious, his left arm ending in gauze wrapped so tight it no longer bled. Harlan had seen this before. Shock. Pale lips. Skin like wax paper. The boy needed blood, and he needed it now. But there were no blood banks on Guadalcanal. There were no refrigerated trucks, no sterile storage units, no gleaming hospital infrastructure. There was only a red Coca-Cola cooler, dented and rusting at the hinges, packed with glass bottles of dried plasma and chunks of ice chipped from a Navy supply ship anchored offshore. Harlan reached into the cooler, pulled out a bottle, held it up to the light filtering through the tent's canvas roof, and watched the amber liquid swirl. It looked like something you might drink at a soda fountain. It looked like nothing that could save a life. But it did. This is the story of how America fought a war with soda coolers and saved thousands of lives with a logistical miracle no enemy could understand. January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal. The air smelled of rust and salt and rotting canvas. In a tent hospital 2 miles inland from Henderson Field, a Navy corpsman named Robert Harlan knelt beside a stretcher, his knees pressed into mud that had once been coral dust. The Marine on the stretcher was 19 years old, unconscious, his left arm ending in gauze wrapped so tight it no longer bled. Harlan had seen this before. Shock. Pale lips. Skin like wax paper. The boy needed blood, and he needed it now. But there were no blood banks on Guadalcanal. There were no refrigerated trucks, no sterile storage units, no gleaming hospital infrastructure. There was only a red Coca-Cola cooler, dented and rusting at the hinges, packed with glass bottles of dried plasma and chunks of ice chipped from a Navy supply ship anchored offshore. Harlan reached into the cooler, pulled out a bottle, held it up to the light filtering through the tent's canvas roof, and watched the amber liquid swirl. It looked like something you might drink at a soda fountain. It looked like nothing that could save a life. But it did. This is not a story about medicine. Not entirely. It is a story about improvisation and abundance, about a nation that turned its factories into pharmacies and its soda machines into surgical wards. It is a story about how America, in the middle of the largest war in human history, discovered that survival was not just a matter of bullets and bombs, but of logistics, of cold chains, of knowing how to keep a fragile yellow liquid stable at 38 degrees Fahrenheit while the jungle outside reached 90. It is a story about Coca-Cola coolers saving lives because America had so many Coca-Cola coolers that even war could not exhaust the supply. And it is a story about what happened when soldiers from other nations, men who had been told that democracy was weak, that capitalism was decadent, that America was soft, saw those coolers and realized they had been lied to. In 1940, the United States military had no centralized system for collecting, storing, or distributing blood. There were hospitals, of course, and there were doctors who understood transfusion, but the idea of a blood bank, a place where blood could be drawn, preserved, refrigerated, and shipped across continents, did not exist in any operational sense. Blood was living tissue. It degraded within hours. It required refrigeration, sterile containers, anticoagulants, careful typing and cross-matching. To move blood from a donor in New York to a wounded soldier in the Philippines was, in 1940, impossible, but plasma was different. Plasma was the liquid part of blood, the part that carried proteins and clotting factors but not the fragile red cells that made transfusion so complicated. If you removed the cells, if you dried the plasma into a powder and sealed it in glass, it could last for weeks, even months. It could be reconstituted with sterile water. It could be given to any patient, regardless of blood type. And most importantly, it could be transported. It could survive the heat of the Pacific, the cold of the North Atlantic, the chaos of a battlefield where refrigeration was a fantasy and sterility was a prayer. The idea came from Dr. Charles Drew, a black surgeon and researcher who had spent years studying blood preservation at Columbia University. Drew understood that plasma, if processed correctly, could be freeze-dried and stored at room temperature, then rehydrated when needed. In 1940, he helped organize the Blood for Britain program, collecting plasma from American donors and shipping it across the Atlantic to hospitals overwhelmed by the Blitz. The program worked. British doctors began using American plasma to treat burn victims, trauma patients, civilians pulled from the rubble of bombed-out buildings. And the U.S. military took notice. By 1941, the American Red Cross had established a national blood donor service. By 1942, pharmaceutical companies like Cutter Laboratories and Baxter were mass-producing dried plasma, sealing it in small glass vials that could be packed into wooden crates and loaded onto cargo planes. By 1943, plasma was standard issue in every American field hospital, every aid station, every Navy medical tent from Tarawa to Anzio. But there was still one problem: heat. Plasma, even in dried form, degraded in extreme temperatures. If the powder got too hot, the proteins would denature, the clotting factors would break down, and the plasma would become useless. The instructions were clear: store between 35 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not expose yourself to direct sunlight. Do not allow it to freeze. In a field hospital in the South Pacific, where daytime temperatures routinely exceeded 90 degrees and the only shelter was canvas, this was not a guideline. It was an impossibility, so the medics improvised. They used whatever they had. And what they had, more than anything else, was Coca-Cola. By 1943, Coca-Cola was not just a beverage. It was a symbol, an infrastructure, a logistical miracle in its own right. The Coca-Cola Company had made a promise to the U.S. military. Every American serviceman, anywhere in the world, would be able to buy a Coke for 5 cents. It was a promise that required the company to build 64 bottling plants on 6 continents, to ship syrup and carbonation equipment and bottles and coolers to places that had never seen a paved road, let alone a soda fountain. The company sent technical observers, men in Coca-Cola uniforms who were exempt from combat duty, to operate the bottling plants, to maintain the machines, to ensure that a soldier in New Guinea could drink the same Coke as a soldier in North Africa. The coolers came with the Coke. They were simple machines, insulated metal boxes with hinged lids, designed to hold ice and bottles in a slurry cold enough to keep soda drinkable in tropical heat. They were painted red, stamped with the Coca-Cola logo, and distributed by the thousands. And they were everywhere. In mess tents and supply depots, on airstrips and in the back of transport trucks. Wherever American forces went, the red coolers followed, and then, one day, someone, history does not record who, realized that a Coca-Cola cooler, packed with ice, could keep plasma cold. It was not official policy. There was no manual, no directive from the Surgeon General's office. It was simply something that worked. A medic in the Solomon Islands would pack his plasma vials in a Coke cooler, bury it under a layer of ice chipped from the ship's freezer, and check it twice a day to make sure the temperature held. A Navy nurse on a hospital ship would store her plasma in a cooler labeled, "Drink Coca-Cola" in bottles, right next to the actual Coca-Cola, because it was the only refrigeration she had. At an aid station in Sicily, doctors kept their plasma supply in 3 Coke coolers lined up against the stone wall of a bombed-out farmhouse, checking the ice every 4 hours, rotating the vials to make sure none of them got too warm. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It was America. The German soldiers who were captured in North Africa did not understand it at first. They had been told that America was a nation of gangsters and weaklings, that its people were too soft for real war, that its factories made toys while German factories made tanks. They had been told that the United States was in decline, that it had no discipline, no will, no capacity for sacrifice. And then they were taken to a prisoner of war camp in Algeria, and they saw the Coca-Cola coolers. They saw American medics pulling vials of dried plasma out of the coolers, mixing them with sterile water, hanging them on makeshift 4 stands made from tent poles and parachute cord. They saw wounded American soldiers receiving transfusions within minutes of arriving at the aid station, their color returning, their breathing steadying, their chances of survival climbing from desperate to decent. And they saw that the coolers were not rare. They were not precious. There were dozens of them, hundreds, maybe, more coolers than there were wounded men. One captured German officer, a major in the Africa Corps, wrote in a letter that was later intercepted by Allied intelligence, "They refrigerate their medicine in soda boxes. They have so many soda boxes that they can afford to use them for medicine. We have been fighting a nation that has more soda boxes than we have ammunition." The letter was not bitter. It was astonished, but the real innovation was not the cooler. It was the system behind it. It was the fact that America had built a logistical network so vast, so redundant, so absurdly oversupplied that even its luxuries could be repurposed into necessities. Coca-Cola coolers were not designed to save lives. They were designed to sell soda. But because there were so many of them, because they were distributed so widely, because the infrastructure of American capitalism had already solved the problem of keeping things cold in the jungle, medics could hijack that infrastructure and use it for something the Pentagon had not planned for. This was the secret that Axis soldiers began to understand, slowly, bitterly, as the war dragged on. America was not winning because its soldiers were braver or its generals smarter. America was winning because it had more of everything. More trucks, more planes, more fuel, more food, more plasma, more ice, more coolers. It had so much that it could waste half of it and still have enough to win. It had so much that its medics could store life-saving medicine in containers designed for leisure, and the plasma itself. This was the other revelation. Plasma was not a miracle drug. It could not cure infections, could not knit bones, could not do anything except replace lost blood volume and buy time. But time was everything. A soldier who went into shock from blood loss had minutes to live. A soldier who received plasma had hours, maybe days, long enough to be evacuated to a hospital ship, long enough for a surgeon to operate, long enough for his body to start making its own blood again. Plasma did not save every life, but it saved enough. By the end of the war, the American Red Cross had collected over 13 million pints of blood and processed it into dried plasma. American medics had administered plasma in every theater of the war, from Normandy to Okinawa. And the Coca-Cola company had distributed more than 5 billion bottles of Coke to American servicemen, along with the coolers, the ice, the infrastructure that made it all possible. There was a moment, late in the war, that captured the strange poetry of it. It was July 1944, somewhere in northern France, 2 weeks after D-Day. An American field hospital had been set up in a barn that had somehow survived the bombardment, though the roof was half gone and the walls were pocked with shrapnel. The hospital had no running water, no electricity, no proper surgical theater. But it had a Coca-Cola cooler, and the cooler had plasma. A young surgeon, a captain from Ohio, was operating on a wounded paratrooper whose femoral artery had been torn open by a shell fragment. The paratrooper had lost more than half his blood. He was unconscious, barely breathing, his pulse weak and thready. The surgeon worked fast, clamping the artery, stitching it closed, but he knew the man would not survive without a transfusion. He called for plasma. A nurse ran to the cooler, pulled out a vial, mixed it with sterile water, and hung it on an 4-line made from surgical tubing in a coat hanger. The plasma dripped into the paratrooper's vein. The surgeon watched the man's color change, watched his chest rise and fall with more strength, watched his pulse steady. And then the surgeon noticed something. The Coca-Cola cooler was still open. Inside, packed in ice, were a dozen more vials of plasma. And next to them, half submerged in the slush, were 3 bottles of actual Coca-Cola. The surgeon looked at the nurse. The nurse looked at the surgeon. Neither of them said anything. But when the operation was over, when the paratrooper had been stabilized and moved to a recovery tent, the surgeon reached into the cooler, pulled out one of the Cokes, and drank it. It was cold. It was sweet. It tasted like America. The Japanese soldiers on Okinawa did not have Coca-Cola coolers. They did not have plasma, either. They had been told to fight to the death, to never surrender, to accept that their emperor required their sacrifice. And they did. They fought in caves and tunnels, held out for weeks without food or water, refused medical treatment because they believed that survival was cowardice. American medics, advancing through the captured caves, found Japanese wounded who had been left to die, their injuries untreated, their bodies wrapped in thin blankets soaked with blood. Some of them were still alive. Some of them were conscious. The American medics treated them. They gave them plasma. They did it not because they were ordered to, but because they had plasma to give. Because the coolers were full. Because America had built a system where even the enemy could be saved, if there was time, if there was supply, if there was enough. And the Japanese soldiers, the ones who survived, who were taken to American hospital ships and given transfusions and surgery and food, could not understand it. They had been told that Americans were monsters, that surrender meant torture and death. And instead they were given plasma in glass bottles, stored in red metal boxes, kept cold with ice that had been shipped from a floating freezer in the Pacific. One Japanese prisoner, a private who had lost both legs in a grenade explosion, asked his interpreter why the Americans were treating him. The interpreter did not know how to answer. The medic who had administered the plasma said, through the interpreter, because we can. That was the truth of it. Not mercy, not kindness, but capacity. America treated its enemies because it had the resources to do so. Because its factories made enough plasma that there was extra. Because its coolers kept things cold even when the world was on fire. The Coca-Cola coolers became a symbol. Not an official one, not something that appeared in propaganda or recruiting posters, but a symbol nonetheless. Soldiers wrote letters home mentioning them. Medics posed for photographs in front of them. In one famous image, taken in the Philippines in 1945, a Navy nurse stands beside a cooler, holding up a bottle of plasma in one hand and a bottle of Coke in the other, smiling like she is holding the two halves of American power, the medicine and the luxury, the necessity and the excess, the capacity to heal and the capacity to enjoy. After the war, the coolers were left behind. They were too bulky to ship home, too cheap to be worth the transport cost. They stayed in the jungles and deserts, rusting quietly, their red paint fading in the sun. Some of them were found decades later by historians and collectors, still stamped with the Coca-Cola logo, still carrying the faint smell of ice and metal and blood. Dr. Charles Drew, the man who had pioneered plasma storage, did not live to see the full legacy of his work. In 1950, he died in a car accident in North Carolina. There is a myth that he bled to death because a whites-only hospital refused to treat him, but this is not true. He was treated. He received a transfusion. But his injuries were too severe, and he died anyway. The irony was not lost on the black medics and nurses who had worked with him, who had helped collect the blood and process the plasma and ship it overseas, even as they were segregated from the white soldiers who received it. The blood supply in World War II was segregated by race, marked with labels that said white or Negro, even though Drew himself had proven that blood was blood, that plasma was plasma, that survival did not care about skin color, but the system worked. That was the bitter, undeniable truth. The segregation was evil, the racism was indefensible, but the plasma saved lives. American lives, German lives, Japanese lives. It saved lives because America had built the capacity to produce it, to store it, to transport it, to keep it cold in Coca-Cola coolers buried in the mud of 1,000 battlefields. The larger truth, the one that the coolers represented, was this: abundance is a weapon. Not just material abundance, but systemic abundance, the ability to produce so much that you can afford to waste, to improvise, to repurpose. The Soviet Union had brave soldiers and brilliant generals, but it did not have enough trucks, enough planes, enough food. Germany had advanced technology and industrial discipline, but it did not have enough oil, enough rubber, enough time. Japan had a warrior culture and a willingness to die, but it did not have enough steel, enough ships, enough of anything. America had enough. It had more than enough. It had so much that its medics could store plasma in soda coolers, its factories could make bombers and refrigerators at the same time, its supply ships could carry plasma and Coca-Cola in the same hold. And that abundance was not an accident. It was not luck. It was the result of 100 years of industrial development, of capitalism run wild, of a society that had learned to produce and distribute and sell at a scale no other nation could match. The German major who wrote about the soda boxes understood this. He understood that the war was not lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factory, in the supply depot, in the refrigerated hold of a cargo ship carrying plasma in one crate and Coke in the next. It was lost the moment America decided to fight, because America could outproduce everyone, outship everyone, outsupply everyone, and still have enough left over to keep its soldiers happy with cold soda. In the years after the war, the Red Cross continued to collect blood, but the dried plasma program was phased out. Refrigeration improved. Whole blood could be stored safely, transported in refrigerated trucks, stocked in proper blood banks. The Coca-Cola coolers were no longer needed. But the lesson remained. The lesson was this: war is not just about courage or strategy or firepower. It is about logistics. It is about cold chains and supply lines and the ability to keep fragile things alive long enough to matter. It is about knowing that a cooler designed for soda can also hold plasma, that a factory that makes soft drinks can also support a war effort, that abundance, when organized, when mobilized, when directed toward survival, is the most powerful force on earth. And the lesson was also this: America won World War II not because it was pure or righteous, but because it was rich. It was rich in resources, rich in industry, rich in the kind of logistical genius that could turn a Coca-Cola cooler into a field hospital's most important piece of equipment. It was rich enough to save lives that other nations would have let die, not because it cared more, but because it could afford to care. There is a photograph, rarely seen, taken in the summer of 1945 on the island of Saipan. It shows a long row of Coca-Cola coolers, more than 30 of them, lined up outside a Quonset hut that served as a medical supply depot. Each cooler is closed, latched, waiting. Inside, packed in ice, are vials of dried plasma, enough to treat hundreds of casualties. But the war in the Pacific is almost over. The casualties are fewer now. The coolers sit idled in the foreground of the photograph. A young medic leans against one of the coolers, a cigarette in his hand, his face tired but calm. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at the ocean, at the horizon, at something far away. And on the cooler beside him, someone has written in chalk, the coldest drink in the Pacific, and the one that matters most. That was the paradox. The Coke was a comfort, a taste of home, a reminder that the war would end and normal life would return. But the plasma was survival. And they shared the same space, the same cold, the same red metal box. The medic in the photograph did not know that he was part of history. He did not know that decades later, historians would write about the Coca-Cola coolers, that museums would display them, that people would look at them and understand something profound about America in 1943. He only knew that when a wounded Marine was carried into his tent, when the blood was pouring out and the shock was setting in, he could reach into the cooler, pull out a vial, mix it with water, and give that Marine a chance. That was enough. The war ended. The coolers stayed. And the plasma, that miraculous yellow liquid that had saved so many lives, became a footnote in the history of medicine, eclipsed by antibiotics and surgery and whole blood transfusions. But the principle remained. The principle was this: survival requires cold. It requires preservation. It requires systems that can keep fragile things stable in a hostile world. And sometimes, those systems are built for other purposes, for selling soda, for making profit, for satisfying a craving on a hot day, but they can be repurposed, hijacked, transformed into something that saves lives. America in 1943 had no blood banks, but it had Coca-Cola coolers. And in the mud and heat and chaos of the Pacific, that was enough. That was more than enough, that was everything.